Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today we have none other than Tyler Roberts. How you doing, man?
Doing great.
Good. So today in this episode, we are going to be talking about how to prepare for an external penetration test. So in this episode, we're going to talk about what an external pen test is, what it is not, and we're going to talk about all the things that you should do, or most of the things you should do before you have an external pen test. External pen tests are an introductory kind of pen test in terms of, on the grand scheme of things, what you test. When it comes to vulnerability assessments, to full-blown red team engagements, and everything in between, external pen tests are one of the first, that we recommend. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Tyler, let's get right into it. What is a pen test? What is it not? Let's talk about that first.
Yeah, the background of an external, I feel like it's important to lay the ground for it because a lot of different companies do externals a lot of different ways. Typically, when you see an organization perform an external pen test, they're looking at two things. They're looking at external facing IPs and they're looking at on-prem resources. What Secure IT 360 did is we took a base external using externally facing IPs and on-prem resources, and we added a few things into it. We added cloud resources, which can be software as a service that is being utilized by an organization. This can be third-party hosted websites or utility that you guys have. And we kind of packaged it all up into an external. So with the cloud resources, a lot of the times we are testing things like web apps. We're testing that SaaS as well. But an external is not primarily meant to test web apps or cloud resources. Just as a blanket statement, those are just add-ins that we added for extra value to clients. So maybe they have an identity provider. We'll do light testing. Maybe there's common vulnerabilities we see like user enumeration flaws and those identity providers. We'll test that on an external. However, that is not an in-depth web app pen test. You're kind of getting like your feet wet with the web app. We're doing your basic injection tests to make sure that the app's flowing correctly. If we see an API, we'll do basic tests on that API as well. But, we're not doing full-blown web apps during our externals, but they are encompassed.
Yeah, and when a client comes to you and says, Tyler, when a client comes to you and says, well, I have all these cloud stuff, what are you going to test when it comes to cloud and stuff like that? You mentioned user enumeration is one, and that's pretty big when it comes to Microsoft services. So maybe talk about how that user enumeration plays into that and why that's important to do that. Right.
So Microsoft 365 in general has user enumeration flaws. Microsoft calls them features. We like to test for those because they're pivotal in further tests that we do, such as credential stuffing or password spraying, brute forcing. We want to enumerate users so that we're using a more concise list of accounts so that our sprays take less time so that we can get more sprays in. Basically, to go into more detail on that is generally organizations have lockout policies of 5 failed attempts within an hour time period or 3 failed attempts. Usually it's around that. It's not common to see organizations with lockout policies that are 5 failed attempts within a 24-hour period, but we also do see that. So if we have a large user list for a large organization, as such as 1,600 to 2,000 users, that spray is going to take more than an hour. So we want to enumerate users using O365 enumeration, using OneDrive vanity URLs to enumerate users. I'll have a write-up on that soon for everybody to read and go in depth about. But using that or going to an identity provider that might provide different messages for valid or invalid accounts, or just using Microsoft's built-in features to enumerate those accounts. There's many different ways and avenues that you can take to enumerate those accounts, but the sole purpose is to cut down time that you're using on other attacks so that you can get more attempts or attacks in.
Exactly, and same goes with web apps. You mentioned earlier we're going to do some light testing of some core functionality features or test for known vulnerabilities and things like that in those web apps, but it's not a full blown web app assessment. An external pen test has its own set of goals and objectives, right? So I think, before you have an external pen test, that's maybe the most important thing. I think planning is the most important thing, right? You have to have a map before you enter the woods, kind of thing. So I think the same applies for security assessments. You should have a plan, and you should understand the goals and objectives of those. So maybe talk to us, Tyler, about an external pen test. Like, before we have an external pen test as an organization or a firm, how should we be looking at those assessments, and specifically, goals, objectives of this type of assessment?
Right. So I think the number one question that we ask, the most important one is, what are your goals or objectives for your pen test? What are you looking to get out of it? What sensitive information do you have externally facing? Or maybe do you have deprecated servers that are running older versions, or, insecure protocols? We like to gather all that information and put that into a document that we can look at, so that we know to spend extra time or put extra attention to the said, more insecure stuff that is public facing. In addition to that, just having good asset management to relay to your pen testers so that they can get a complete scope that you guys have, because a pen test is a point in time assessment. So we like to spend less time finding, what are your external IPs, and more time, trying to break in through those external IPs and maybe ports and protocols that they have open. So that's a big thing for us, is just the pre-scoping for an engagement, and really just the communication from the organization of what they have out there and what needs to be tested.
Yeah, exactly. And, for us, whether it's a web app, an internal and external, mobile, etc., our goal is to find as many vulnerabilities as we can in that time limited engagement, right? We're going to help identify those things, help provide recommendations and solutions to fix those things, work with firms to triage those vulnerabilities, to fix them, retest them, etc. But again, it is time limited, and understanding, what are you hoping to achieve out of this exercise or this engagement is really important, so that if you do want us to focus a little bit more on finding those cloud-based attack vectors or SaaS-based attack vectors, right? Maybe that's a big concern for you, is that users are in your environment, or users in your organization are notorious for setting up shadow IT, right? They're signing up for all sorts of cloud third-party services like Zoom and Dropbox and all this stuff without kind of the IT administration kind of baked in. So maybe that's your area of focus, and you really want us to enumerate as many cloud apps as we can, or SaaS products, to see kind of what the risk might be there. So we would spend more time on that, right? As Tyler was saying. Or maybe it's, you're concerned about the data that's out there. Maybe you have some executives or some VIPs in your firm that are very public facing, or they're notable figures, and you want a little bit more of a deep dive into the dark web and sensitive information that might be out there, right? We do dark web searching. We look for credentials and sensitive information on the dark web as part of our reconnaissance process in our external pen test. But that's something we can, fine tune and spend more time on. So that's where understanding the goals, objectives really come into play. And finding things that you just missed, right? That's something that happens all the time. We either find things that were missed or forgotten, or we find things that the client had documented that were theirs, but were not actually theirs, right? So those things are very important, for asset management. It's like, look, you gave us this list of IPs, but you kind of give us the wrong ones. This scope doesn't look like it's yours. Is this yours? That kind of thing. So we have those discussions.
Right. So to recap, the number one thing before you have an external is just understanding those goals and objectives that you have. Number two, which we kind of segued into a little bit, is asset inventory and documentation. So, doing a full inventory before you have that pen test. So these are my IPs. Here are the servers I have externally facing. Here's what software they're running, things of that nature. Just knowing what you have to be able to relay that, so that we as pen testers can spend less time having to find all of your IPs and more time giving you the benefit of attacking. would be number two.
Yeah, and I think on that note too, Tyler, I think it's important to know what you have, who owns it, who secures it, who maintains it, right? Case in point, or an example, right, is a WordPress website. Maybe your public website is hosted by XYZ company, it's maintained by another company, and then a third company does like content creation or management of the content for you or something like that. It's important to know who's responsible for updating the WordPress plugins, who's responsible for maintaining DNS records for that public website, right? Because when we have findings where there's a number of subdomains that are available that are resolving to IP addresses that you own, you want to know who you need to go to kind of get that fixed or to look into that issue. So
Right.
knowing who owns it, in terms of who owns the risk, right? And who maintains it, secures it, updates it, that kind of thing is important too. So that when you do get that report and there's, X number of issues, you automatically know who to go to. You're not kind of wondering which team does what or what vendor is going to help you kind of fix that issue.
Right. Knowing externally who owns stuff as well as internally, if you have different teams that own different apps or, different servers, that's all important because it's less back work at the end of the engagement, trying to find and track down who owns what, and then trying to get fixes implemented accordingly. When beforehand, if you have all that information at the end, it's just, okay, I need to send an email to this, this, and this, and then those issues get fixed a lot quicker than, if you hadn't have done the inventory to know who maintains and secures those applications or servers.
Yeah. And we talked about vulnerability assessments a little bit. We touched on it, but that's something I think that's also important too, is before you have a pen test, do some external scans yourself, right? Do some external reconnaissance or Nmap scans or maybe vulnerability assessments on your external footprint first, so that you can kind of get a sense of where you're at, right? And you're not kind of going into the pen test blind. But what else would you recommend on that front in terms of external assessments before doing an external pen test?
Yeah, just to piggyback off what you said in terms of doing that vulnerability assessments on the external, if you're more apt to do that and you have more stuff cleaned up, that's more time that the pen tester can focus on other vulnerabilities that are discovered. So, a lot of the times we see TLS and SSL issues just sitting out there that takes time to analyze, corroborate, and make sure it's a true positive. If those are fixed prior to the engagement, before you even think about getting the engagement, just running those vulnerability scans and fixing those issues provides a lot more time for the pen tester to, look at other stuff, explore other avenues that are discovered, and things of that nature.
Yep. Yeah, especially if your footprint is rather large, right? If you have numerous websites, you have multiple login portals, you have multiple, edge devices or VPN endpoints, or Citrix, remote access, or whatever it might be. Those are things that our attackers are really going to go after, is like VPN, login portals, that kind of stuff, edge devices. And the more time we can spend kind of verifying that those things look pretty good and are solid, the better value you're going to get than us just running down TLS issues, like you said.
True. Another thing to do before your engagement is, I feel like, establishing a good chain of command for us to utilize throughout the engagement, because a big thing for us is communication. We like to keep those channels open 24/7 via phone and email. We're big on communication. So if anything critical does come up, just having good people in line for those issues to go to, or for us to call and relay issues to throughout the engagement is pivotal.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that, you don't realize it's that important until the communication breaks down, right? Where, there's a miscommunication, or there's a delay in communication, or delay in receiving or sending important information. And then that's when you realize, like, oh yeah, it's kind of important to have a good chain of command, like in terms of communication back and forth.
Right.
So what about, what should clients do in terms of, we touched on this a little bit, but sensitive data, right? There's, I don't know how many millions and cajillion of credit passwords, right? Breach data on the internet, right? Passwords, credit card numbers, social security numbers, PII, et cetera, et cetera. We hear about a breach every day in the news. We do some dark web searches as part of our external pen test. What would you say to people listening or clients, how should they approach dark web searching? Should they do it, before an external pen test? To what extent? Like what extent do you think they should be doing in terms of looking for some of the bad stuff on the internet, credentials or PII, that stuff?
I think at the bare minimum, clients or organizations should be looking for breach credentials that they have on the dark web. A common misunderstanding is that that's just, that's breach credentials from your environment. 9 times out of 10, those breach credentials come from something that somebody signed up with their company email on, right? And, humans are just apt to reuse passwords because it's easier to remember. And not everybody's going to use unique passwords on every single application. So, a lot of the times we do see those passwords being reused for applications, and those avenues are being opened up from, you signed up for parking.com had a data breach. Now I have your password that you use for company resources as well. So doing those searches for your users and looking at what data is out on the dark web, and then relaying that information internally, saying, hey, notice you had this out there, make sure to change your password. Doing that, I feel like would be the bare minimum.
Yeah. And, it also gives an attacker a little bit of intelligence on how users are creating passwords in your environment or potentially in your environment, right? If they're using, if you notice they're using the street address with the date that the firm was founded with a special character, that's really, really, really powerful information, because dollars to donuts, they're using that password somewhere else, especially something like that, because it's something related to the organization or to the firm. And it's specific enough where they're going to use it for something work related, right? Probably not going to use it for the personal Gmail, but for company SharePoint or ShareFile or company Dropbox, company XYZ SaaS product, maybe there's a good chance. So that gives us a lot of intelligence as an attacker and information to go on. And maybe we just, need to increment a special character or a number or something like that. But that it does give us a lot of information.
Right. And guys, you don't have to have a super expensive recorded future license to go look for things like credentials on the dark web. There are cheaper or free tools. One that we use in-house is Dehashed. You can pay for API calls, or you can just pay for a subscription and use it accordingly. And that will look up, users and breach passwords in your environment, just using your domain name. You can also look up individual user accounts in Dehashed if you're worried about your account and not your buddy's account, So there are tools out there that are available for that won't cost you an arm and leg as an organization to use.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great. What else? Is there anything else from an external perspective? Like, what else? Is there anything else that firms should be doing before they have an external pen test?
I feel like we've hit the big points, understanding those goals and objectives, using your resources to perform asset inventory, documentation, running vulnerability scanning, external in-house vulnerability scanning to see what you can find of an external footprint. And then, searching dark web for resources prior to your pen test to see what your pen testers are going to see. All that is pretty important, I guess. I mean, that's all I can think about in terms of pre-engagements.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot more that goes into it. There's obviously a lot more nuance, but the goal of this episode is to hopefully talk about some of those things, bring some of those to light, kind of have a dialogue around some of the things that we think you should do before you have an external pen test. And these are also not one and done things, right? Like, goals change, objectives change. Even if you had an external pen test last year, right, Tyler? Like, you might want the goals to change a little bit. Assets change. There's new data breaches like every day, and that is new information. IT is standing up new infrastructure, and people in the firm are registering for new SaaS applications and products. So this is a constantly changing thing, right? So, this is something to do repeatedly in kind of a process, in a cycle, not just a one-off, before we do it, a pen test, we're going to do this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think, as a final note, just understanding what type of pen test you want, what type of external, because, if you want a black box assessment where your pen tester knows nothing and see the value you get out of that, or if you want a white box assessment where you get the pen tester everything and just see, with all this information, what can they break, just kind of communicating that to your team, to your pen testing team, and kind of establishing, what's important to you, I feel like would be the most pivotal thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, that goes back to the objectives and goals is, making sure you understand you as the consumer of the pen test understand the expectations of what the pen tester is going to do and how they're going to do it is really important so that you feel satisfied and you get value from that engagement.
Right.
All right. Well, that's it. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you for listening and or watching. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love if you would share with your network, share it on LinkedIn, share it on Twitter, share with your friends and colleagues. If you think you got value from it and you think others would, we would greatly appreciate it. You can check us out at offsec.blog or at secureIT360.com, and we will see you next Wednesday.
Thanks for listening, guys.